Welcome to the sixth lecture of Styling Identity and Ideology in an Age of Riches and Revolution, Rococo and Neoclassical Art in France and its Caribbean colonies, 1748 to 1815. With Lecture 6, we have reached the painter Jacques-Louis David and the Davidian style of Neoclassicism. Looking back to Lecture 4, we will remember that Neoclassicism arose in the 1760s and 70s following two major trends. The first was purely aesthetic. Following the archaeological rediscovery of Pompeii and Herculaneum, artists became interested in imitating antique forms and pictorial approaches. Thus, we have Vien's work from 1763. It's a kind of visual interpolation of an ancient Roman fresco that had been recently engraved by Carlo Noli, as so many ancient works that inspired contemporary artists were. Although the work has a frieze-like composition, classicizing stylistic elements in costume, furniture, decorative objects, and architecture, and even an antique setting for its subject, we said the work was really still Rococo in spirit, since the subject is light-hearted, even a little naughty, centered around female figures, and soft in its palette, although not necessarily tending towards the same color scheme and painterly approach as Boucher and Fragonard had. Overall, Vien's work might be said to characterize a decorative vogue for the antique style. But the second contribution to the development towards Davidian neoclassicism of the 1780s was the call for more serious subject matter. Remember, art critics and theorists praised the century of Louis XIV and asked for a revival of the spirit of grand manner painting and Poussin's work. Artists should forget about Ovid's loves of the gods and instead mine Livy and Plutarch for inspiration for the more serious subjects from antiquity. Greuze's 1778 painting, The Father's Curse, The Son Punished, anticipates the marriage of serious subject and neoclassical compositional approaches, but you will immediately notice that Greuze was dealing with contemporary subject matter and not yet synthesizing Vien's use of classical settings and subjects. One of the earliest answers to the call for serious subjects occurred when Marigny's administration commissioned artists to portray the benevolent acts of four Roman emperors. Vien, as one of the esteemed artists of the time, fulfilled the commission with this representation of Marcus Aurelius in 1765, but it was not well received. While subsequently, Dongeville's administration pursued the idea of royal support for serious history painting in the 1770s, and Vien, incidentally, would be elevated to the first painter to the king, all the threads of neoclassicism would only come to fruition in the work of David. Before I talk about David's groundbreaking paintings of the 1780s, I want to situate his work in our chronology. We are still in the reign of Louis XVI, whose wife Marie-Antoinette is probably more popularly known than the king. David traveled to Rome in the 1770s and really emerged as a force at the French Salon in the early 1780s. His famous Oath was exhibited at the French Salon of 1785. In this chronology, I've also tried to convey that, due to David's influence, the 1780s was the decade that was least fettered by lingering Rococo influences or emerging Romantic trends. In this video, I will say a bit about David's early biography, since he really is an intriguing personality, as well as the preeminent artist of his generation in France. A native Parisian, he was born in August of 1748 and lived for almost 80 years, which means that he witnessed all of the social and political upheavals that brought France from the royal Bourbon monarchy to revolutionary republic to Napoleonic Empire and back to Bourbon restoration. As a child, he had a fairly standard boarding school education. His father died before his 10th birthday, and two uncles helped take care of him, namely his mother's brother Biron, who was an architect, and his mother's brother-in-law de Maison, who eventually led him to connections with such personalities as the dramatist Cédenne, who would become his friend and protector in his young adulthood. Meanwhile, he entered Vian's atelier in 1764, and Vian recognized him as a great talent, immediately ready to paint, when pupils typically began with drawing lessons before moving on to painting later. David was a student at the Académie Royale by his 18th year in 1766. He was admitted to the Prix de Rome competition for the first time in 1770. He did not win, but was admitted again the following year when he obtained the second prize. The next year, he was admitted once again, but having failed to win the prize for the third year in a row, he had suicidal thoughts, and the accounts of his despair attest to an already temperamental personality, one that felt things deeply, and is thus perhaps more strongly in line with a romantic spirit than with an emotionless Enlightenment one. He failed again in 1773, having submitted this, still rather baroque, rendition of the Death of Seneca, but managed his emotional response better. Around this time, he was struck by a fencing sword, called a foil, that permanently deformed his face. He suppressed this deformation in his self-portrait of 1791, but it would have appeared as a tumescence in his right cheek around the mouth area, also causing the right side of his mouth to droop down. Given the varying degrees of touching up that he did in all of his self-portraits, David, who was so taken by ideal beauty, seems to have struggled with this physical imperfection, which caused more than one commentator to refer to him as ugly. In 1774, he finally obtained the first place in the Prix de Rome competition and embarked for Rome the next year. He traveled with Vian, who had been named director of the French Academy in Rome. David marveled at the discovery of so many diverse Italian masterpieces as he traveled south down the Italian peninsula to Rome, but it was really his trip to Naples with the antiquarian Quatremère de Quincy and the exposure to the recently excavated antiquities that opened up a whole new world for him. He said, "It seemed to me that I had just undergone an operation for cataracts. I had to make a break with everything I had previously believed to be beautiful and true. I felt that copying nature without selectiveness was a vulgar endeavor, but that proceeding like the ancients and like Raphael was what it really meant to be an artist." This quote, with its search for le beau, the beautiful, and its call for an artistic correction of nature, reads very much like a Meng's essay, a Reynolds discourse, or a Winckelmannian doctrine. It's the neoclassical academic theory of this time, the beau idéal. Despite such stimuli, Vian noted in a letter to Dangeville in 1779 that David was tired and melancholic. There is evidence that David may have fathered an illegitimate child around this time, and I won't presume that that was the cause. Instead, I bring up this quote because it reinforces the idea that David was a sensitive man who felt things strongly. Pensioners at the French Academy in Rome were expected to send paintings that served as a kind of progress report back to Paris. Such paintings were known as an envoi because they were sent from abroad. The French word for send is envoyer. One type of work was designed to show mastery of the male nude, and this subject was known as an académie. It probably sounds like a strange label given the institution itself is known as the Académie, but in many regards it is the most emblematic type of academic production. David produced two stunning male académies during his Roman stay, including this one, often called Patroclus. There was a tendency at this time to imbue these male nude studies with deeper content, and you'll notice the arrows on the lower right side of the painting. But recognizing Patroclus in this figure takes a bit of contrivance. Although Battoni apparently encouraged David to stay in Rome and continue what was really his learning period, as did Vian, the perhaps homesick David returned to France. Back in Paris, David created a history painting by which he was agréé, or admitted to, the Académie. This was Belisarius. It was exhibited, along with about 10 other paintings and with tremendous success, at the Salon of 1781. Drawn from Marmontel's banned novel of 1767, the apocryphal subject of Belisarius follows precedence in the late 1770s, which also capitalized on the moralizing theme of ancient virtue. While some have seen it as one of the earliest works to break with sentimentality in the vein of Richardson's Pamela, others have found that David's painting retains a bit of the sentimentality typical of Greuze and of the drame bourgeois. Perhaps there is something inherently sentimental about the subject. Belisarius was one of the greatest generals in the 6th century of this era, but his success earned him enemies. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian, under whom he had served, ordered his eyes to be put out when he was incriminated in a plot against the emperor. The former general was thus reduced to begging in the streets of Rome. David depicts the moment when one of his former soldiers recognizes him begging at the foot of a classical monument. If you're wondering why Marmontel's novel had been banned, it was because in the work, Justinian was framed as an unjust tyrant who failed to recognize the faithfulness of one of the best men in his service. Belisarius is thus elevated to a kind of Enlightenment-era secular saint, a martyr to tyranny. Meanwhile, shortly after the conclusion of the 7 Years' War in 1767, the parallels between the capricious and autocratic Justinian and King Louis XV were obvious, and despite the fact that Marmontel was a member of the Literary Academy who had been a protégé of Madame de Pompadour, there was also an inflammatory chapter on religious tolerance. Thus, David's strong and sober painting combines 3 moralizing themes. First, the act of charity. Second, the injustice of tyranny. And third, the radical reversal of power and fortune, embodied by Belisarius, but communicated through the startled soldier who recognizes his old commander and the condition of a blind beggar. The background here, with the obelisk and the temple, is still redolent of Poussin. As noted, the painting was praised at the Salon and even earned the critical attention of Diderot, who wrote, "This young man shows the grand manner. He has soul, his heads have expression without affectation, his attitudes are noble and natural, he draws well, he knows how to cast a drapery and paint beautiful folds, his color is beautiful without being brilliant." Most scholars agree that David admirably rendered anatomy and physiognomy, carefully emoting complementary sentiments of pity in the woman giving alms, of suffering in the blinded old general, and of earnest youthful entreaty in the fallen general's boy companion. David has masterfully interlocked the poignantly contrasting bodies of the 2 latter figures, almost enveloping the slender young boy in the bulky forms of the old man, and he anticipates his later oath with a clustering of hands at the center that eloquently echo the figures' respective physiognomic expressions, thus reinforcing the sentiments and rendering even clearer the meaning of the story. At the same time, this cluster of hands creates an interesting formal play of gestures that utilizes size or weight, direction from left to right, orientation, open palm or backhanded, and height within the composition. Within this cluster, the vertically aligned stacking of Belisarius in the boy's hands further serves to simultaneously unite them and contrast them in subtle ways. Since they are facing in different directions, the large open palm of the aged man and the small back of the hand of the boy form their own visual whole, as if the left and right limbs emerge from one body. At the same time, the appearance of the large, sinewy, and weathered hand on top contrasts with the small, delicate hand beneath. The round bronze helmet, which adds mass to this central cluster, feels heavy at the ends of the boy's thin, outstretched arms. This poetic tension between contrast and unity underscores the interdependence of the still muscled but crumpled old man and the spry young boy who is but a helpless child. Meanwhile, there is a different sort of formal linking of the two figures on the left that reinforces a kind of psychic doubling between them as well. It's almost as if the surprised soldier has sprung out of the charitable woman, serving as a thought bubble for her emotional state. You might also say that he has but to bend forward and assume her place once she has moved on and he has collected himself. Together, these two figures express the sentiments that the public faced before the awe-inspiring figure of the fallen general. Of course, the four figures, though paired on their respective sides, also offer a formally cohesive whole. The virtually aligned gazes of the soldier and the woman strongly draw the viewer's attention from left to right. The play of gestures at the center, which we have discussed, creates a back-and-forth movement between the two halves. Visual arcs, both discrete to each pair and also reaching across the figures as a whole, create graceful and cohering, but also narratively poignant, rhythms. Another work David showed at the Salon, an equestrian portrait, attests to his often overlooked brilliance as a painter, and not just his skillfulness as a composition builder. It showcases his exceptional refinement in treating tonalities and color harmonies, as well as a much livelier handling of paint than in the Belisarius. The portrait represents Count Stanislas Potocki, who came from one of Poland's most illustrious families and was making the grand tour in Rome just before David's departure from the city. Accordingly, the painting was sketched out in the Eternal City and completed in David's Paris studio. Potocki was an art lover and admirer of Winkelmann, and at only 23 years old, commissioned the, as yet largely unknown, relatively young 30-year-old David to paint his largest work to date, measuring 9 feet high and at the prestigious scale of some of Battoni's full-length portraits of grand tourists. Shortly after the Salon of 1781, where he received great acclaim, David visited Flanders, and there discovered the brilliant colorism of the Flemish painters. He received quarters in the Louvre in 1782, and he married later that year at the age of 33. His young bride was 17. Their first child, a son, was born 9 months after the wedding. In 1783, he was received as a full member of the Academy. His reception piece was the history painting Andromache Mourning Hector. It was exhibited at the Salon with another 10 works. In late August of 1784, one of David's best pupils, Germain Drouais, the son of a fairly well-known painter, won the Prix de Rome shortly before the age of 19. The win was anticipated by David, and he had already been planning to return to Rome with his favorite pupil in order to steep himself in the right environment to bring the germ of his idea for the Horatii to its fruition. Thus, by early September, David left for Rome with his family, accompanied not only by Drouais, but by 2 other pupils, Vicard and Drouais, a relative of the latter, and 2 others. Signed at the end of 1784, the Oath of the Horatii met with an unprecedented, tremendous success when it was exhibited in Rome in 1785. The general public, art connoisseurs, and artists alike acclaimed the work, a 13-foot wide history painting that was exhibited at the Paris Salon in August of 1785 and met with a sensation in his native city as well. The Oath of the Horatii is both the neoclassical manifesto and the epitomical example of the neoclassical style. It represents a new aesthetic and a new moral order. Though retrospectively seized on by the revolutionaries as an emblematic work, the painting was actually a royal commission, representing the fruition, really, of D'Angeville's program to reinvigorate history painting with noble, virtuous, serious, moralizing subjects. As I will explain in a moment, the idea of an oath is David's conception, but the larger story is taken from Livy, in Latin Titus Livius. Livy recounts how in 669 BC, Rome and neighboring Alba, both nothing more than small city-states at such an early date, are at war. It is decided that the dispute would be resolved by a combat between three champions from each side. The Romans select the Horatii brothers, and the Albans select the Curiatii. But here's the twist. A twist that makes the subject worthy of classical French drama, for the 17th century dramatist Colonies actually penned a work, Horace, in 1640 that provided the direct inspiration for David. As told in French classical prose, Sabina, a sister to the Curiatii brothers, is married to a Horatius, while Camilla, a sister to the Horatii, is betrothed to a Curiatus. While the married Horatius accepts this call of the Roman people as his patriotic duty, the betrothed Curiatus is loath to make adversaries of his in-laws. You can see the inherent tragedy of the situation. Since you know that Rome would go on to have a long and illustrious history, and since the Horatii are the subject of this painting, you might have inferred that the Horatii would be victorious, but you might have also inferred that a bit more drama would unfold. Two of the Horatii are killed before the remaining Horatius manages to kill all three of the Curiatii on his own. The hero, excoriated by his sister, whose fiancé he has killed, punishes his sister with death. The subject appealed to late 18th century audiences for its figuration of heroism and even patriotism, the private family's sense of public duty and moral obligation over any personal concerns. At the same time, 18th century audiences would be keenly aware of the underlying tragedy that makes a good story so compelling. For so many lives are filled with insurmountable tragedies, and we are drawn to the pathos of the situation. It is precisely the conflict of these themes, heroic patriotism and tragic pathos, that are formally divided into different sections of the canvas. The men embody the former, the heroic patriotism, and the women on the right embody the latter, the tragic pathos. And really, it is the inherent conflict and David's masterful presentation of it that makes this work sublime. Before we get to a formal analysis, let's consider the real subject of this painting. We now know the whole story, but what this really is a picture of an oath-taking. It's not really a moment of action. It doesn't depict an outcome, but it is a pregnant moment. Originally, David had thought about showing the denouement. One drawing shows the death of Camilla. Another shows the elder Horatius defending his lone surviving son over the corpse of his daughter Camilla. The compositions are less inspired and forceful, and the themes of patriotic duty and self-sacrifice are all but lost in the explicit depiction of the overly severe treatment of Camilla. Instead, David landed on exactly the right formula for preserving these virtues, while also hinting at the tragedy to come in his rendering of the women. In fact, their presence here reinforces the theme of sacrifice. Their men, having been called upon by their country to battle what are their in-laws or would-be in-laws, have more at stake than even their own lives. Two other depictions of an oath preceded the Horatii, and David was inspired by the motif's iconographic power. Fuseli's more obscure painting, The Oath of the Rütli, had more recently appeared in 1780. Fuseli was a German-speaking Swiss artist who moved to Britain and pursued his career as a painter there. This work should indicate to you that there were strong romantic tendencies emerging in exactly the same decade as neoclassicism, although historians have generally treated Romanticism as a subsequent movement, largely because it took hold of French painting a bit later. I will have to talk more about this another time, but I have limited the scope of this course as much as possible to French art, and art that shaped the development of French art, so you will be mostly left to explore Fuseli's fascinating art on your own. I will only say briefly that Fuseli's painting depicts the legendary oath traditionally dated to 1291 and taken in the Horatii meadow to mark the founding of the old Swiss Confederacy by the representatives of the three cantons, and that Fuseli's painting is done in a completely different style from David's. In fact, we could discuss it as a foil to David's painting and elicit some of the differences between Romanticism and Neoclassicism more broadly. Another precursor was Gavin Hamilton's Oath of Brutus from 1763. You know from an earlier lecture that Hamilton was one of the important figures in the early development of Neoclassicism, and this is certainly an antique subject. However, this work retains some Baroque holdovers. In any case, David clearly recognized the visual power and silent eloquence of an oath-taking and invented a moment in the story of the Horatii that appeared neither in Corneille nor in Livy. David affably remarked that he owed his subject to Corneille and his painting to Poussin, but just as he reached beyond Corneille to harness his own powers of invention, he also departed stylistically from Poussin's model to achieve a much more innovative formal conception. There are two hallmarks of classical art that you'll notice immediately. First, the restraint, clarity, and sobriety of the treatment, and second, the frieze-like composition. Remember, the latter means that the figures are placed from left to right in virtually the same plane. Although we do have an arrangement of space that is 3 figures deep, these men on the left are so tightly pressed together that it visually serves to compact the real sense of space and evokes antique low-relief sculpture. The gentle rhythms of the undulating line that flows between the two women on the far right is so unifying and forceful that, likewise, it emphasizes a flat disposition of forms as much as the solid modeling reinvests them with volume. Their poses, though sculptural in one way, have also been calculated to avoid foreshortening and accentuate horizontality. Overall, the arrangement that clusters figures at each side of the canvas leaves room for a restful spaciousness and visual clarity, and even the block-like unity of the clusters themselves helps clarify that each is a single thematic unit, warrior and worrier. Along with the pared-down, frieze-like composition, we have another hallmark of neoclassical space, and that is the box-like perspective, or stage-like space. The figures are, in fact, fully rounded with a convincing three-dimensional space that is perspectively precise and clear. By stage-like, I mean that the room would be reproducible literally on a stage at the theater, where your seat would be at the center and slightly raised. We know what our position is by finding the vanishing point, which sits at eye level. The vanishing point is quite easy to find in this image because, following from principles of the High Renaissance, the tiles on the floor have visible orthogonal lines converging at the vanishing point. Also following from a Renaissance compositional tradition, the vanishing point occurs at what is a focal point or visual emphasis for the composition. Here, that is the place where the elder Horatius's hand holds the swords, the place where the oath is concretized. The focal point is further emphasized by the visual thrust of the men's extended arms that direct us to this site of the oath. The converging hands, rendered with David's typical skill for anatomy, provided an unexpected but aesthetically satisfying cluster of forms against an otherwise blank background. This reminds me of another famous Renaissance painting where hands are placed at the center of the composition and framed by empty space, likewise serving as a focal point to serve as a narrative device for the story being told. Can you think of what this very iconic work is? Michelangelo's creation of Adam, of course. Like a traditional stage, the scene offers a distinct foreground and background, which harmonize nicely when viewed together. The background decor, upholding the typical classical principles of simplicity and clarity, is shadowy and severely reduced, leaving the emphasis on the foreground figures. More than the massive columns, the eye is drawn towards the three arches they support. This architectural background creates a sense of symmetry that strongly balances and stabilizes the composition. The use of architecture to create a near-symmetrical balance in a composition is another common high Renaissance principle. The arches also serve, formally, to distinguish three different groups, each with a different purpose. The central figure exhorts, providing, as I noted, a kind of concretized site for the abstract idea of an oath in the hands that hold aloft the swords that the men will carry into battle. As the patriarch, he is the embodiment of the fatherland itself, the time-worn but solid rock of the nation, so to speak. The group of brothers on the left responds to the exhortation with a firm, upright vigor. They embody a building energy which will ultimately be released in battle, but which is already evident in their carefully studied poses. The gently billowing drapery accentuates the ardent forward surge of the tight bodies. They are filled with heroic determination and the ideal of patriotic virtue. On the right, a group of women representing anguished emotion offers a total contrast to the determined action and energy on the left. The movement, turned in on itself, glides gently on smooth, supple curves rather than surging on rigid, angular lines. The gap between them accentuates this thematic contrast, the powerful heroism of the bold, brave men versus the impotent grief of the soft, distraught women and innocence of the children. In class, we will generate a longer list of words that further describes the stereotypically masculine qualities in both formal and thematic terms and the stereotypically feminine qualities. For now, I hope it's clear that there is a marked gender divide in this picture that relates ideas about manhood and womanhood with certain aesthetic qualities. A comparison with the original conception, which includes an adolescent male on the right side, indicates that David rethought his work to accentuate, rather than diminish, this idea of gender division. Furthermore, the inclusion of children is a common means of creating a sense of added urgency and potential tragedy. Some scholars have found a devaluation, not just separation, of the feminine space, particularly in the context of the imminent revolution that ultimately privileged patriarchal values. It is clear that patriotic duty is the celebrated virtue here. These men are willing to give their lives for their country, and society needs valorous and strong individuals who concede all personal and family interests to the primary interests of the patrie, to fight for what is righteous. On the other hand, the social order clearly requires a yin and a yang. In this sense, the emotions expressed here by women cannot be considered superfluous. Even if the emotions that the women freely indulge in here ultimately need to be suppressed, they are not for that reason absent in the heart of men. In fact, without these emotions, the righteousness and bravery of the men would have no meaning at all. The sacrifices of the few will preserve the freedoms, the family integrity, and the right to emotional richness for the many. Beyond the formal division of thematic elements, the composition is carefully organized in accordance with Enlightenment principles of rationality, with a rigorous and efficient arrangement of varying elements. A strong emphasis on verticals and horizontals creates a grid-like substructure. We see this grid-like pattern repeated at perspectival angles in the tiles of the floor or blocks that make up the wall. The stark light also recalls the artificial lighting of the theater, though it serves to define material surfaces and also to reinforce a sense of volume among the flattening arrangement of the figures. The brushwork is tight and meticulous, in stark contrast to the loose and spontaneous brushwork of Fragonard. There is an effective harmony of colors, with reds tending to earth tones and muted blues tending towards gray. The deep shadows and neutral background, with its passages of more vibrant colors amongst the figures, suits the painting's combined themes of austere discipline and determined energy. All in all, David's audience viewed this work as a radical departure from everything that came before, and because of it, bestowed David with the unofficial title of Reviver of French painting. The call for artworks that use examples from antiquity to illustrate humanity's highest virtues has been fulfilled in this consummate work. To paraphrase the scholar Nanteuil, David has put the powerful symbolism of oath-taking into a new context, where it transfigures the virtue of sacrifice into the founding act of a new aesthetic and moral order. The following year, in 1786, David's closest follower and pupil, Jean-Germain Drouais, exhibited Marius at Minturnae. Drouais probably went even farther than David in his austere, pictorial, and thematic qualities. Please reflect on this so we can discuss that a bit in class. You may remember that Drouais had left for Rome as the Prix winner, shy of 19 years old, less than 2 years earlier. As a student at the French Academy in Rome, he had to ask special permission to make such an ambitious picture. That's to say, a large history painting, in this case 8 7/8 feet by 12 feet, that would be exhibited at the Salon. The work depicts the Roman consul and general Gaius Marius after his imprisonment at Minturnae, where he fled to escape his political enemies in the Senate. Although it is a historical event in the days of the Republic, 88 BC to be precise, Plutarch gives an almost mythical account of his execution, in which Gaulish cavalrymen, Latin equis, agreed to take charge of the execution, whereas no Roman citizen would. The Gaul entered Marius's dark prison room with his sword, but believed he saw the formidable 69-year-old Roman's eyes shooting flames, and heard a voice that said, "So you are the man who dares to kill Gaius Marius." The would-be executioner fled. In fact, Marius survived his imprisonment without execution and staged a comeback in Rome, where he was elected consul for the 7th time shortly before his death. It's worth noting that this work, which was created just 3 years before the storming of the Bastille, is one that casts a Roman Republican populist leader who supported the plebs over the patricians as a legendary heroic figure. David's Death of Socrates, dating to 1787, is housed at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. The work is smaller in scale than his large-format history paintings, measuring about 6.5 feet wide. The subject of the painting is another example of Stoicism, or ancient virtue. Socrates was sentenced to death by poison, specifically hemlock, in 7th century BC Athens for criticizing the tyranny of Critias. Crito suggested he flee, but Socrates serenely accepted his fate as one final supreme lesson. Formally, the work is still in the vein of Poussin, with more lucid tones, a simplified frieze-like composition, and the stronger precise light and realistic details of Caravaggio. David reduced the number of those present in Plato's account to 12. Can you guess what significance some scholars have given that number in this picture? It would correspond to the 12 disciples of Christ. The cup of hemlock is at almost the exact center of the composition, a clear focal point, recalling once again David's penchant for isolated, eloquent hand gestures. Overall, the painting is less stark than the Horatii. the visual lines are more supple and flowing, while the figural arrangement captures some of the disorder of grief. The color harmonies are further honed and are quite beautiful. The death of Socrates features a similar neutral architectural background to the Horatii, but there is a stronger sense of depth, with the opening in the wall leading ultimately to a stairway to the outside world. In the center, Socrates, vigorously upright, raises one arm as if to punctuate his lesson. With his other arm, he reaches carelessly, almost inconsequentially, for the hemlock. Holding the cup of poison, the tribune's vassal looks away, simultaneously moved and ashamed of his task. Crito sits by his master's side with a comforting hand on his knee. At the end of the bed, on the left side, sits Plato, who would have been a young man at the time, but who is rendered in a more recognizable form as a solemn old man. The remaining disciples on the right side express sadness and pity in various ways, while Apollodorus, whom Socrates sent away for his overwrought behavior, is represented as the individual leaning against the wall just around the corner. 3 others leave in a more distant background, and some scholars have identified the waving figure as his wife, Xanthippe. Other narratively poignant and archaeologically particularizing details include the antique-style lamp on its stand, the lyre beside Socrates on the bed, the chains from which he has been liberated at the moment of execution, and the scroll, which, discarded where it is, evokes Plato's telling of the death of Socrates in the Phaedo. Meanwhile, the head of Socrates has been idealized with regard to more ancient Greco-Roman portrait busts, and his athletic form, even in a clearly middle-aged body, has been idealized as well. Admiration for David only rose with the exhibition of this work, and we might appreciate his unique approach to composition and expressive figures that makes him such a master in the new neoclassical idiom when we compare the work to Perron's Socrates in the same year. Incidentally, this was also a personal triumph for the ambitious David, since Perron had been his great rival for many years. Having beat David in the Prix de Rome contest, Perron was the artist in whom the academicians placed their hopes. The jury may still have been out in 1785, but David clinched the top spot at the Salon of 1787. Thomas Jefferson, who was in Paris at that time, called David's Socrates the best thing at the Salon. Sir Joshua Reynolds, the president of the British Royal Academy, called it the greatest effort in art since Michelangelo's work in the Sistine Chapel and Raphael's chambers in the Vatican. Such an encomium is not necessarily overstated. Neoclassicism took itself quite seriously and had strong aspirations. If artists wanted to produce works of excellence, why shouldn't they surpass the great masterpieces of the past? It would be anathema to the Enlightenment spirit to believe that the best accomplishments had already been achieved. Speaking of Joshua Reynolds and the British Royal Academy, you may remember Angelica Kauffmann, a Swiss-born painter who had been raised and studied in Italy before patronage led her to London, where she befriended Reynolds and became a member of the new Royal Academy. I have discussed the significance of the beau idéal when describing the subject of Zeuxis in her 1778 painting. In 1781, Kauffmann returned to Rome after marrying an Italian artist. From that period of her life date these 2 pictures on the right, also at the Met. But as the nature of painting progressed towards a more strongly neoclassical formal approach in the 1780s, I wanted to mention one of her works from 1785, Cornelia pointing to her children as her treasures. Like David's Socrates, Kauffmann's painting typifies the neoclassical goal to improve the viewer by imparting a moralizing message in Greco-Roman themed compositions and styles. We call a subject such as this an exemplum virtutis, or a model of virtue. The painting depicts an episode from Roman Republican history, and so the architecture and dress are specifically inspired by Roman examples. Cornelius' sons are the future political leaders Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, who sought social reform in the 2nd century BC. They learned their exemplary ethics from their mother. Here we see a visitor who has come to Cornelia's house to show off her worldly treasures. When asked to show her treasures in return, Cornelia gestures towards her children instead of going to fetch her jewelry box. As noted, David had a certain affinity for portraiture, as well as history painting, which of course helped him earn a living. Unlike Vigée Lebrun or l'Abbé Guillard, he did not have direct contact with the royal court, but his repertoire included large-scale, full-length portraits for wealthy clients. Monsieur Lavoisier and his wife, another stunning work dating to 1788 and housed at the Met, measures almost 9 feet high. You may know Lavoisier's name since he was the first great French chemist, making this a wonderfully emblematic image of the Enlightenment era. Lavoisier achieved fame by determining the composition of water and in synthesizing the compound from its elements, hydrogen and oxygen. As a fermier général, or tax collector, he was also extremely wealthy. Madame Lavoisier, herself a tax collector's daughter, had a passion for chemistry that matched her husband's. Furthermore, she also took drawing lessons from David, and accordingly, you might note the portfolio off to the side. The glass laboratory instruments, themselves carefully rendered still-life masterpieces, bear witness to the Lavoisier's experiments, but have no practical purpose here. David was paid the astronomical sum of £7,000 for this work, nearly the double he received for the Horatii, which was a royal commission. I hate to tell you that this happy couple, united here in a kind of casual tenderness, suffered during the Revolution. Just 5 years after this portrait was made, Lavoisier would be arrested with all former tax collectors on false charges of defrauding the state, a brazen means of seizing the goods of these wealthy individuals. Several months later, he would be beheaded at the age of 50 in 1794. A certain Lagrange has been quoted as saying, "It took them only an instant to cut off his head, and 100 years might not suffice to reproduce its like." Around the same time, David was working on another painting of a couple, although some ambivalence is expressed in their mutual attachment. This is Paris and Helen. Of course, Helen might feel some ambivalence. She was the prize that Venus awarded to Paris, and being the wife of the Spartan Menelaus when she became the Trojan prince's prize, she was also the cause of the mythic Trojan War, the so-called face that launched 1,000 ships. I won't take the extra time to say too much about this work, but I wanted to show you another side of David. This is a private royal commission from the king's brother, the Comte d'Artois, although it would also be shown publicly at the Salon. It shows David's beautiful handling of paint and great sensitivity for delicate color harmonies, an alternative means to the similar ends of more sensual painters like Boucher and Fragonard. Of quick note, it also exemplifies the Greek conventions of male nudity and female dress, be the dress in a sheer revealing fabric. It would be fun to look at all the types of pictorial conventions and archaeological references David used to assemble this picture, but it's enough to note in passing that even David's neoclassicism was not limited to serious pictures, and the quintessentially Rococo subject of love never really disappeared from the repertoire. David's Brutus, which dates to 1789, is another work on the theme of heroic sacrifice, once again during the ancient Roman Republic. At a quick glance, what do you see? Women in distress occupying a prominent place in the highlighted right portion of the canvas. They are responding to death. There is a body laid out, its legs highlighted on the upper right, where lictors carry it on a stretcher. In shadow, In the foreground on the left is a man whose clenched hand and twisted feet may easily be read as suppressed anguish, in juxtaposition to the overt expressions of the same sentiment to his upper right. But we must know who Brutus is to get the deeper meaning of this story. The painting represents Lucius Brutus, who was first consul of Rome in the earliest days of the Republic during the 6th century BC. Like so many of these narratively rich historical paintings of the time, the Salon title was a bit longer. It read, Brutus returned to his home after having condemned his 2 sons to death for joining in a conspiracy with the Tarquin kings against Roman liberty. The lictors bring back their bodies so that he may give them burial. As with the Horatii, David has turned a historical political event into a family drama, where mixed emotions meld into one harmonious pictorial whole. Whereas death and violence are foreshadowed in the Horatii, they have already taken place here. Although audiences might find room for ambiguity in David's choice to highlight the tragedy of historical events, he is instead once again using grief to underscore the personal sacrifice that makes a man a hero. David's agitated and troubled Brutus embodies the strict morality of the Republic's first defender, who sacrificed his sons due to their conspiracy to bring back the monarchy. Lest you find it shocking that a father would have his sons condemned to death for their political actions, consider the way families in this country have been recently ripped apart by certain political events. Brutus actually had much more at stake. His whole family had been wiped out by the king Tarquinius before he swore an oath to expel the Tarquins from Rome and establish a republic in place of the monarchy. In fact, Brutus was elected as one of the first consuls of the Roman Republic. We will discuss the political implications of this republican overturning of the monarchy for David's own time shortly, but let's consider David's choice of subject while drawing attention to Brutus's oath. While I have previously shown these images to indicate how David was pictorially and thematically inspired by the subject of an oath in general, you may not have recognized the particular subject of Brutus's oath. In both of these paintings, we see the suicide of Lucretia, who took her life after being raped at knife point by Sextus Tarquinius, the youngest son of King Tarquinius. Brutus, whose friend and cousin Collatinus was Lucretia's husband, drew the suicidal dagger from her fatal wound, and with his friends swore on it an oath to overturn the depraved and discredited monarchy. The oath-takers led an ensuing revolt in Rome that brought an end to the reign of the Tarquins and the commencement of the Republic. These works by Hamilton and Beaufort are certainly antecedents to the Oath of the Horatii, and although we'll see David return to the theme during the revolutionary years proper, he obviously found the story of Brutus highly compelling and probably had some preliminary thoughts about rendering the subject at the time he was commissioned to do the Oath of the Horatii. Brutus was not a state-sanctioned subject in 1789, and we'll see why. For the moment, I wish to underline that it was very much David's choice. I think this thorough understanding of the story itself also makes it clear David viewed Brutus as an unequivocal hero, rather than someone forbidding and ruthless in his convictions. In fact, he humanizes Brutus by rendering him as a tortured soul, accepting the consequences of his moral convictions and probity. His sons were seduced by the dark side, so to speak, and their mother's family members led them into an alliance with the monarchical Tarquins. After suffering so much at the hand of the Tarquins, Brutus had no choice but to sign the order for and witness his son's execution. It is this death order, the salvation of the Republic and the source of his personal torment, that he clutches in his hand. Brutus is cast in shadow, a pictorial approach that contemporary critics recognized as daringly novel. Like David's compression of the 3 young Horatii into one plane and the general disposition of that composition, it was something that, quote, had never been seen before. The lighting overall is more diffused than in the Horatii, giving it a slightly less theatrical appearance. David, however, controls the light very carefully. It rakes across the corpse and further highlights the grieving women, leaving most of the rest of the picture in shadow. The work has another similarity with the Horatii, and that is the division of space along a vertical axis that creates male and female spheres, an approach that can hardly be called overplayed, since its effectiveness keeps it fresh. On the left, Brutus is paired in shadow with the statue of Roma, a juxtaposition that symbolizes the first consul's patriotic love and devotion to country. On the right, the strongly lit women outwardly express their emotions of overwhelming horror and grief. One of the girls even faints. But the composition is not so simple. There is certainly an underlying grid-like structure with an emphasis on strong horizontals and verticals. The columns and the tiled floor again serve to reinforce this. The repetition of horizontals here accentuates the starkly supine body being brought in on the litter. But the cast shadow and the energetic gesticulation of the mother also create diagonal visual lines that reinforce the connection between the two spaces established through the use of light. Brutus's posture is noticeably askew in the grid-like structure and formally reinforces his sense of agitation. The undulating visual lines within the pyramidal cluster of women, largely created through an array of upper limbs and flowing drapery, are the most complex. At the center of the composition is a visual void, which further emphasizes its compartmentalization. Slightly off-center to the left, the back of the chair gently swoops down from the lictors holding the litter to the arc made at the feet of the women's drapery. Slightly off-center to the right is the lonely sewing basket. David's palette, typically, emphasizes autumnal earth tones, with blues ranging from greenish to grayish. In the true spirit of neoclassicism, David continued to strive for archaeological accuracy in the decor. He once again used furniture produced by Jacob. The statue of Roma and even the head of Brutus also attempt to reproduce archaeological details. The Doric columns add to the sobriety and majesty of the setting. So how can this work anticipate the French Revolution? Although one could argue that the Republican interpretations of the work have been overdetermined by the fact that the revolution broke out shortly after this work went on display, one could also argue that Republican ideas had been mounting to that breaking point for over a decade, and that David, who became a staunch Republican during the Revolution, simultaneously formed his political ideology and expressed that ideology in his paintings, even without considering that France might one day adopt those same ideas. I have mentioned that the broader subject of Brutus was very much David's choice, just as this imaginative pictorial rendering of historical events was very much his own artistic conception. The work was another royal commission through the Dongeville administration. However, David departed from the precise subject that he had been contracted to paint, which was another Roman figure of the early Republic, Coriolanus. As noted, the political climate in France in the 1780s was a mounting crescendo towards republicanism, highly influenced by the War of Independence that led to the establishment of the United States, and in which France fought for the Americans. And the Enlightenment ideas about liberty were joined by virulent attacks on the monarchy. For example, the art historian Thomas Crow notes one scandal in the society that led to someone shockingly placing a large sign in front of the Queen's box in the theater that read, "Tremble, tyrants, your reign is about to end." This was in 1788, and it couldn't have been more prescient. The administration was aware of the climate, and in response, the censors were striking any works with potentially anti-monarchical or otherwise socially inflammatory messages. Accordingly, as Crow further notes, when in 1786 there was a successful revival of Voltaire's tragedy on the subject of Brutus at the theater in Paris, it was halted after just one performance. The reason was that Brutus was being included in radical tracts. Having heard the story of an elected representative form of government taking down a monarchy, in fact, the foundational story of the Roman Republic, we can understand why. The revolutionaries would praise David's prophetic work, as they called it, and raise the artist on a pedestal. Who's to say it didn't contribute to or reinforce the growing anti-monarchical sentiment of the time, perhaps even converting some future revolutionaries to a republican ideology? After all, the Salon was a place to which people from all social classes flocked to view artwork for a season. Even if it had served primarily as a site for entertainment and dilettantism for most, why shouldn't the new official aim to edify also offer a more subversive education?